The professor held up Zariah's private blog on the lecture screen and sneered, "Let's debate whether she even belongs at Harvard." Laughter erupted. No one stood up, not even the other black students. Her face burned as centuries of silence echoed louder than the crowd. But then, a white student hit record, and the entire campus would never be the same. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. From the moment Zariah Walker stepped onto Harvard's campus, something in the air shifted, not just in her but around her. The crisp fall breeze carried with it the sharp bite of exclusion masked as prestige. Everything about the place was designed to whisper power in hushed tones. Red brick buildings, older than most cities, marble statues of men who had never imagined a girl like her setting foot here, and archways that framed ambition for those already chosen. But for Zariah, ambition had always been survival in disguise. She walked through the lecture hall's double doors, with the same quiet determination that had gotten her through the rest of her life. Still, the silence that greeted her arrival was different from the usual. It wasn't the kind of pause that came from reverence or curiosity. It was tight, judging, as if her presence disrupted some sacred algorithm coded into the Ivy League's invisible traditions. She could feel their eyes before she met them, rows of students dressed in neutral luxury, scanning her like an unexpected footnote in an otherwise carefully edited essay. Professor Aldridge stood at the front of the room, gray-suited and glassy-eyed, holding a thick academic text, as if it were the final say in every debate. When his eyes landed on her, a flicker passed through them. Not recognition, not welcome, but evaluation. He held the book out, slow and deliberate, and the room seemed to hold its breath. His tone, even without words, was sharp with expectation and barbed with disbelief. Zariah accepted the book. Its weight wasn't just physical. The cover alone screamed exclusivity. Abstract title, embossed lettering, no picture, no color, just ideas wrapped in language not meant for her, not designed for her to decode. She felt it instantly. This wasn't about learning, it was about testing. Not her knowledge, but her legitimacy. And as she flipped through the first pages, the challenge became clear. The text was intentionally dense, the prose designed to exclude. But it wasn't just academic rigor that made it impenetrable. The language framed oppression as policy, slavery as economic necessity, and systemic racism as a theoretical debate. It was a weapon disguised as curriculum. The students around her turned back to their laptops, some smirking, others indifferent. The professor didn't need to say more. His message had already echoed through every brick in the room. She didn't belong. But Zariah had learned long ago that silence was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of pressure, and she had spent her entire life mastering how to breathe beneath it. Her mother's warning had never left her. They'll never expect you to fight with grace. So that's exactly how you win. So she read. Every line. Every word. Not out of compliance, but out of defiance. And as she read, something shifted. What began as humiliation morphed into revelation. Buried in the middle chapters, she recognized phrases that weren't just academic, they were historical dog whistles, echoing real-world policies that had destroyed communities like hers. The author cited theories once used to justify redlining, incarceration disparities, and biased IQ testing, all under the guise of cultural analysis. The framework didn't just reflect racism, it reinforced it. This wasn't education, it was indoctrination. Her stomach churned, not with fear but fury. And it wasn't just for herself, it was for every black student who had ever sat in that room before her, and had been too afraid or too alone to question what was handed to them as true. It was for her younger brother, still in high school, who believed Harvard was a dream worth chasing. It was for her grandmother, who had scrubbed the floors of people who sent their children to places like this. The textbook wasn't a mistake, it was a strategy. Zariah's fingers tightened around the pages. This moment wasn't just about her ability to read, it was about her willingness to respond. She wasn't being asked if she could comprehend the material. She was being dared not to challenge it. She began to research. In between lectures, she spent late nights in the library tracing the citations, following academic trails that led back to white supremacist ideologues from decades past. Some of the authors were discredited long ago, but their theories had found new life through sanitized language and strategic omission. Others were more recent, still teaching, still lecturing, still publishing under Ivy League banners. She documented everything. copied passages, created timelines, connected names. The web grew fast, and it wasn't just about this one professor, it was systemic. What she uncovered went beyond one classroom. A network of faculty across multiple departments had been citing one another's work, reinforcing the same racially biased theories under different terms. Cultural determinism, meritocratic strain, moral inferiority. They'd created an echo chamber of intellectual racism, too complex to be questioned by outsiders, too polished to be challenged by insiders. And yet, none of it surprised her. What shocked her was how easily it had survived, how effortlessly it had embedded itself into the academic bloodstream. There were no slurs here, no overt hate, just footnotes, chapters, and published journals that turned centuries of black pain into data points on a graph. Still, Zariah knew knowledge alone wasn't power. Not here. Not now. The real question was what she would do with it. One evening, alone in her dorm room, she stared at her growing file of research, dozens of pages, screenshots, citations, and historical parallels. Each one was a match. Together they could start a fire, but lighting that fire would cost her. Her academic standing, her scholarship, maybe her safety. These institutions didn't erase dissent loudly. They suffocated it quietly, with accusations of incivility, with whispers of instability, with claims that passion was aggression. But Zariah had never fit the mold, and now she had no desire to. Her presence here was no longer just about personal ambition. It was about disruption. The next morning, as the professor stood before the same classroom, ready to continue his lesson, uninterrupted, Zariah raised her hand, not with hesitation, but precision. She calmly opened the textbook to page 142 and asked a question, not to learn, to review. She cited the original source behind the theory, a disgraced policy advisor from the 1950s, whose writings were later adopted by segregationists. She linked the passage to modern policing policy. The classroom froze. The professor shifted. Then he stuttered. He tried to deflect, to reframe, but it was too late. The seed had been planted, and the murmurs in the room no longer belonged to her detractors. Some students looked down, embarrassed. Others stared at her, stunned. Zariah didn't blink. Her voice remained steady, her hands unclenched. She hadn't just answered the professor's question. She had shattered the foundation it was built on. But even she didn't anticipate what would come next. Buried in the citations of that same textbook, Zariah found a name she recognized, a faculty author tied not just to racist theory, but to a secret that linked directly to her own family's past. Zariah sat frozen beneath the flickering dorm light, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling slightly, as she reread the author's name beneath the chapter that had first caught her eye. It was there in thin serif font, Dr. M. Silas Trenton, co-author and historical consultant. The name should have meant nothing. But it did. She had seen it before, not in a lecture, not in an academic journal, but in a photograph buried in her grandmother's basement. A photo nearly a century old, faded at the edges, showing a young white man in a tailored suit standing on the porch of a large southern house. In the corner of that same photo stood a young black girl, barefoot on the steps, her great-grandmother, Zariah Walker. Her mind reeled. Could it be the same man? Could this university's esteemed academic figure have once stood over her own ancestors' labor? The idea felt absurd at first. Impossible. But the deeper she sank into the historical record, the more dots began to connect. Dr. Trenton was an emeritus professor with honorary titles in sociology and public policy, celebrated for his objective racial theory models in post-war America. But his early research, long before it was published by Harvard, had roots in Southern agrarian culture, plantation economics, racial productivity studies, and familial lineage logs, an eerie academic obsession with slave genealogy masked as statistical research. Zariah knew then that the textbook wasn't just problematic. It was dangerous. It wasn't simply an intellectual product. It was personal, a calculated tool designed by minds that had once rationalized chains and labor camps. And now, decades later, their ideological fingerprints were being sold to students as historical truth, sanctioned by Harvard's pristine reputation. She could not unsee it. Still, she moved cautiously. She copied the chapter pages, bookmarked archives, traced the professor's early papers, and compared them to census records from the 1920s. The name Trenton appeared multiple times in Louisiana land documents. Her own family's roots were tangled there too. And with every detail, her stomach sank further. Her admission into Harvard, The place her guidance counselor once called her escape route was now starting to feel like a trap built generations ago. When she took the evidence to the dean's office, she expected discomfort, but she didn't expect dismissal. The administrator, a carefully polished woman with an impressive string of credentials, skimmed the pages with a bland expression and offered nothing but a soft sigh and a loaded phrase that chilled Zariah to her bones. Context matters, Zariah. Don't read so literally into legacy documents. Legacy documents. That was their language for generational racism. Zariah left the office not defeated, but sharpened. That meeting didn't just confirm her suspicions, it crystallized her strategy. The administration would never hold itself accountable. They had institutional amnesia by design, a curated memory that erased discomfort the moment it threatened prestige. If she wanted truth, she'd have to pull it from the roots herself. Every archive, every email, every whispered denial. And if she couldn't bring the institution down, she could at least force it to show its teeth. Back in her dorm, she launched a deep digital dive into Harvard's internal library system. The permissions were limited, but Zariah wasn't just tech-savvy, she was strategic. Using metadata trails, she uncovered old faculty memos, academic correspondence, and drafts of the textbook that had nearly broken her spirit in class. Early versions revealed edits that softened brutal realities into vague academic neutrality. Words like enslaved were replaced with unfree laborers. Terms like systemic control were watered down to social contracts. Every sentence had been tailored to cleanse history of its cruelty and repackage it for white comfort. But the most chilling discovery came late one night, buried in an email thread from 12 years prior. It was a private exchange between Dr. Trenton and the same professor who humiliated her in class, Aldridge. In it, Trenton warned, "We must control the narrative. If these young students start rewriting the framework, the funding dries up. The myth of merit must hold." The myth of merit, that was the rot at the center of it all. Zariah stared at those words until her eyes blurred. She understood now that the textbook wasn't just about education. It was part of a legacy project, one designed to preserve generational power through the language of academia. And Aldridge wasn't just a passive lecturer. He was a gatekeeper. As dawn crept through the windows, Zariah printed every document, annotated each with piercing red ink, and stored them in a folder labeled proof. Her hands moved faster now, not just with rage, but clarity. They had written their truth into paper, and hoped no one would read between the lines. But she had, and now she wouldn't stop. Word of her suspicions began to trickle across campus. Whispers followed her into classrooms. Students she'd never spoken to glanced her way, some with curiosity, others with caution. A few black students gave her nods, silent acknowledgments that said, "We see you," without saying a word. But most stayed quiet, unwilling to risk the fragile balance that came with existing in spaces never meant for them. The weight of isolation returned, but Zariah had already learned to carry it like armor. When she confronted Professor Aldridge during office hours, he smiled without smiling. His voice, practiced and cool, dismissed her findings as academic interpretation. He claimed she lacked the pedagogical maturity to assess historical context properly. It was the same performance he had likely given dozens of times before, masking intellectual violence as instruction. But this time, Zariah recorded the conversation. He never noticed a pen on her binder was actually a microphone. What she captured wasn't profanity, threats, or overt slurs. It was something more insidious. A calm voice systematically justifying oppression. A man so wrapped in the illusion of neutrality that he couldn't hear the venom in his own words. When Zariah played it back later that night, she realized how terrifying it was that so much harm could sound so polite. But she didn't stop there. She compiled her findings into a single document: textbook excerpts, archive screenshots, historical parallels, and the recording. She titled it Harvard's Hidden Curriculum and sent it to a select group of students and faculty she trusted. It spread faster than she expected. Within 24 hours, several faculty members requested a private meeting. A student-run forum invited her to speak, and a Black Studies professor emailed her simply, "You've rattled the hornet's nest. Don't stop now." Zariah knew she had crossed a line. There was no returning to anonymity, no more hiding in the back row. The spotlight was shifting, but exposure was only one piece of the war. She needed to dig deeper, beyond theory, beyond the modern. She needed to know why Harvard had protected this narrative for so long. The answer wouldn't be found in policy or syllabi. It would be buried in bloodlines. A librarian from the restricted archives emailed her under an anonymous account with 6 cryptic words. Your last name is in the ledger. Zariah didn't sleep that night. The 6 words from the anonymous librarian echoed louder than any headline ever could. Your last name is in the ledger. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a declaration, and beneath it a thread of urgency. If her family's name was in a Harvard ledger, it wasn't as donors or alumni. It meant something far more complicated, and far more damning. The restricted archives were hidden deep beneath the Widener Library, behind an unmarked hallway, only accessible with layered permissions. Zariah didn't ask questions when the anonymous instructions arrived later that morning. A time, a door code, and a note warning her not to use her student credentials. She borrowed a friend's ID, covered her face with a scarf, and slipped into the depths of Harvard's untouched history. The moment the heavy vault-like door clicked open, she knew she was walking into a space not designed for eyes like hers. The air was cold, dry with the scent of old paper and ink long settled. There were no polished signs, no welcoming displays, just rows of steel cabinets, oversized books too heavy for modern shelves, and record boxes dated in calligraphy. A manila folder had been left out on the table, right beneath a single desk lamp, as if someone had already known exactly what she'd come looking for. Inside were original estate records from the 1800s, lists of assets, property transfers, and names. The handwriting was elegant, almost gentle in its cruelty. Names catalogued like inventory. Age, race, trade skill. Beside one entry, a name leapt out and burned through her. Lillian, aged, domestic servant. Assigned to Trenton Estate, 1849. Zariah's chest tightened. Her great-great-grandmother's name, in ink older than electricity, tethered to a family that had once owned her bloodline. The same Trenton Estate tied to the very professor who co-wrote the textbook still taught in classrooms above. But the horror didn't end there. Scrawled in the margins of the same ledger was an annotation, dated 1910. Relocated to Massachusetts under arrangement with Harvard endowment sponsor. Household asset transition to campus residential staff. Household asset. They hadn't just used her family's labor. They had moved them like furniture. Her ancestor had been folded into the machinery of the university long before diversity statistics made room for students like her. She stared at the paper as if it might change, as if the words might apologize. But they didn't. The ink remained steady, proud, unrepentant. Zariah didn't cry. She felt her breath thicken, her jaw tighten, but no tears came. The weight of it wasn't just in the paper, it was in her blood. This place, which questioned her intelligence at every turn, had literally been built off the back of her lineage. It had extracted labor, stolen humanity, and then a century later, handed her a scholarship with the expectation that she'd be grateful, that she'd behave, that she'd perform excellence without asking questions. But now the questions wouldn't stop. She kept flipping through the records, and what she found next upended everything. There were logs of payroll from the early 1900s. Names scribbled beside positions like laundry assistant, groundskeeper, and maid. One name appeared consistently over decades. Mavis Walker, Zariah's great-grandmother. A woman she remembered only faintly through the stories her mother used to tell how she worked in a big house, wore a white apron and walked miles to send her boys to school. But this wasn't just some private home. It was the staff quarters at Harvard's early dormitories. Mavis had lived her whole life on the edge of this campus, invisible in its official histories but instrumental in its function. While scholars debated black pathology in pristine classrooms, black women like her great-grandmother scrubbed their floors, and now, generations later, Zariah was being graded by their intellectual descendants. She scanned the documents and emailed them to herself, uploading backups to cloud drives under coded names. But when she returned to her dorm that evening, something had shifted. Her student portal was inaccessible. Her email was frozen. Her ID card wouldn't open the main library anymore. Panic clawed at her throat as she tried her phone. Wi-Fi connection gone. She rushed to the IT help desk, but the tech assistant shrugged it off, claiming it must be an internal reset due to unusual activity. A coincidence, they said. But she knew better. When she pulled out her backup flash drive to transfer files onto her personal laptop, a warning flashed. File corrupted. Cannot open. Then another, and another. The documents had been wiped, erased like they had never existed. Her laptop froze. The screen went black, and a sharp clicking noise echoed from the hard drive. Someone had already been in her system. She checked her phone's call history. A log of strange numbers. A voicemail from a blocked contact. A robotic voice recited, "Unauthorized access will be reported." cease inquiries or face academic suspension under Policy Code 1. The institution had stopped pretending. Zariah stood in the center of her room, surrounded by a silence that now felt hostile. Her heart thudded against her ribs, not from fear, but clarity. She wasn't just challenging a professor or a textbook. She was threatening the narrative that had held this institution together for over a century. And now they had turned inward, deploying quiet retaliation, surgical and cold, but they hadn't destroyed everything. She still had the photograph from her grandmother's box, the one showing Lillian on the steps beside that white man in the tailored coat. The man who now had a building on campus named after him. A building where lectures on ethics and morality were held daily, and she remembered her grandmother's words as she held the photo years ago. He was kind to her, but she was never free. That building, she realized, was more than symbolic. It was built on land once owned by the Trenton family, later donated to the university in exchange for naming rights and a commemorative chair in policy research. It all connected. The names, the land, the lectures, the lie. She needed to get inside that building, really inside, not just the classrooms, the basement, the sealed records room, listed in campus blueprints, but no longer included in modern tours. She'd need help, someone who could bypass access restrictions, someone with tech skills and nothing left to lose. As she opened her second laptop to begin again, her hands hesitated over the keys, and that's when she noticed something else. An auto-saved email draft in her inbox that she didn't write, opened but unsent. The subject line read, "She's starting to connect it. Handle it quietly." Someone had logged into her account from inside the university's admin server. Someone high up, and they were preparing to silence her before the truth reached the surface. The eerie silence of her dorm room no longer felt like a pause between assignments. It felt like surveillance. Zariah sat motionless, staring at the flickering cursor in the email draft she never wrote. Her skin tingled with an electric unease. It wasn't just paranoia. The evidence was everywhere now, hidden in corrupted drives, glitched logins, and now unauthorized drafts composed by invisible hands. Someone was inside her system, manipulating her words, warping her actions, and laying traps she couldn't see until they snapped shut. In the days that followed, strange things began happening more frequently. Her Harvard ID, once the golden key to every door on campus, now blinked red at the most critical times. It denied her access to the library archives, the computer labs, even her own residence hall after hours. The security guards shrugged with practiced indifference, citing technical errors. But the timing was always too precise to be coincidental, always just after she tried to upload new research, always right before she needed a meeting, always when she was on the verge, sharing something critical. Her files were next. PDFs she'd saved with backup names were now blank. Word documents filled with historical connections between her family and the university were replaced with gibberish. Even her notes, ones she kept handwritten as a safety measure, went missing from her dorm desk drawer. Her room hadn't been broken into, her lock hadn't been forced, but somehow her pages were gone. No one ever mentioned it. No note, no warning, just absence, carefully measured. Zariah knew she needed help beyond the institutional firewall. She reached out to Roman, a computer science major who operated in the campus underground, a network of quietly brilliant outcasts who understood systems better than most administrators. Roman didn't ask many questions when she explained the situation. He'd seen the university's quiet retaliation methods before. A black student's graduation project inexplicably flagged for plagiarism, a Latina activist's financial aid suddenly misfiled. But this was the first time someone brought him hard data screen captures, glitch logs, and altered document metadata that clearly showed timestamps from internal IP addresses. When Roman traced the breach, his screen went dark for a full 2 seconds before it came back up with a blinking warning. Access restricted, monitored activity detected. Then, buried in a folder disguised as an outdated policy update, they found it an internal admin group labeled Legacy Integrity Task Force. It was a name that sounded like something out of a corporate compliance handbook, but its access level suggested otherwise. The group had clearance above academic departments, above student affairs, even above IT. The folder contained scripts designed to track keystrokes, monitor login behavior, and flag disruptive academic patterns. But what stunned them both were the names in the task force's watch list. Every single one was a student of color. Some names were current, others dated back over a decade. Most were gone, transferred, expelled, silenced. Not a single one had made it to graduation. Zariah's heart sank as Roman read her file aloud. The tags included high criticality risk, narrative interference, and worst of all, legacy threat potential. She wasn't just being watched, she was being preemptively dismantled. Later that night, her phone vibrated with a single-line message from an unlisted number. Stop digging, or your scholarship disappears. No greeting, no threat of violence, just a quiet promise of erasure. Zariah didn't panic. She'd seen this tactic play out before, in the stories her mother told of factory jobs lost after complaints, or in the way her high school had handled complaints about the teacher who regularly mocked African-American vernacular English during English lit discussions. Institutions didn't attack you directly. They let you unravel slowly. They turned your environment against you, made others uncomfortable in your presence, and then watched as isolation did the work of suppression. But Harvard had miscalculated something crucial. Zariah wasn't alone anymore. News of her discovery about the textbook and her digital erasure was already trickling into the corners of campus that didn't make headlines. The group chats of black and brown students, the whisper networks of staff custodians, even among a few faculty members who had grown tired of towing the institutional line. One janitor quietly left an old folder in her hallway trash can, labeled History Student Affairs 2001-2011. Inside were redacted reports and quiet withdrawals. Students who had challenged grading patterns, housing inequities, or curriculum bias, and who vanished without public record. These weren't just accidents of bureaucracy, they were intentional disappearances. Zariah no longer walked through campus like a student. She moved like an investigator, piecing together fragments of truth while avoiding traps laid out in administrative niceties. She began mapping where her digital footprint triggered surveillance. The classrooms with disabled Wi-Fi, the buildings where her ID scan took longer than usual, the offices that never responded to her requests until she appeared in person. Roman installed a VPN tunneling shield and built a shadow server where she could upload her documents safely. She nicknamed the drive the archive, a space to keep the truth alive. And she didn't stop. Every lecture she attended, every conversation she overheard, every syllabus scanned for language that sanitized oppression, she documented it all, not for revenge, but for protection. Because the only thing more dangerous than a racist institution was one that believed it had nothing left to hide. Still, the pressure was mounting. Her professors began to subtly question her tone. A group project was reassigned without notice. A quiet email warned her that continued academic disruption may affect her enrollment status. And yet none of it surprised her. The school wasn't trying to silence her because she was wrong. They were desperate because she was right. One afternoon, after leaving a guest lecture in the Trenton Center, a building she now viewed like a monument to stolen labor, she noticed a security guard following her, not aggressively, not even obviously, but always a few steps behind. It happened again the next day, and then in different faces. Same distance. She started receiving pamphlets under her door, campus counseling resources, mental health wellness tips, and one titled, Knowing When to Pause, a guide for overwhelmed scholars. It would have been laughable if it weren't so calculated. The school was preparing the narrative in advance. Zariah wasn't being targeted. She was just struggling. But what they hadn't anticipated was how methodically she was cataloging every moment of it. The most disturbing revelation came when Roman decrypted a set of IP logs routed through the administration's private network. They found a session logged into her student profile not just to alter files but to rewrite her course history. A failing grade had been manually entered into one of her classes, a course she hadn't even taken yet. When she brought the records to the registrar's office, the woman at the desk blinked twice, scanned the screen, and whispered for Zariah to come back after hours. That night, in the dim glow of a quiet office, the registrar pulled up a restricted access tab Zariah had never seen. Her entire academic path had been flagged under Evaluation Protocol 47. The criteria? Narrative threat, reputational liability, anomaly to legacy culture. Zariah's blood turned cold. The school had created an entire algorithm to identify students like her. Those who didn't just study history, but exposed it. Those who didn't just attend but questioned. Those whose very existence in those buildings rewrote their mythologies. The registrar slipped her a key, an old brass master key, labeled B-3. This doesn't exist anymore, she whispered. But if you really want the truth, it's buried under the Trenton Center. Zariah stepped into the lecture hall with her shoulders squared, her chin lifted not out of confidence but sheer necessity. She had spent the night examining the old brass key, labeled B sub 3, tracing its worn edges with her thumb, while mentally retracing every corridor of the Trenton Center. She knew where it led, or rather where it used to lead. The sub-basement had been closed off decades ago, officially listed as structurally unsound, but rumors whispered of sealed archives, restricted records, and forgotten things that institutions like to keep buried. She'd make her way there soon enough. But first, this lecture. The lecture hall had always felt colder than the rest of campus. Not just in temperature, but in spirit. It was the same auditorium where Professor Aldridge had first questioned her intellect, where he had handed her a textbook like a challenge, not a tool. Today, as she slid into her usual seat, near the middle row, something felt different. The air buzzed with anticipation, like the room itself knew something was about to happen. Too many heads turned at once. Too many conversations halted the moment she walked in. Aldridge stood at the front of the room with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he typed something into the lecture computer. The overhead screen flickered to life. What appeared wasn't a slide or course outline. It was her private blog, not her academic blog. Not the portfolio site she used for class, but the private, locked journal she had written in solitude. The one she used to document her thoughts, suspicions, and emotional unraveling, as she unraveled the institution. The screen displayed a post titled "When Institutions Feel Like Inheritance: Harvard's Legacy of Silent Violence." Below the title were her personal reflections, raw, unfiltered, written in exhaustion at 2 a.m. Her words were not crafted for public consumption. They were meant to be her truth, her record of surviving erasure. A hush fell across the room, sharp and electric. Professor Aldridge cleared his throat, his tone dry with academic detachment, as he told the students today's class would be an exercise in open intellectual critique. He gestured toward the screen and invited the class to evaluate the logic, tone, and merit of what he called a concerning ideological piece, written by one of your peers. No name was mentioned, but none needed. Everyone knew who had written it. Zariah sat frozen, every nerve in her body screaming in betrayal. She hadn't shared that blog with anyone, not even Roman. It had been stored on a separate drive, password locked, protected behind multiple security layers. Somehow Aldridge had found it, or more likely, someone on the Legacy Integrity Task Force had delivered it to him. The room did not remain silent for long. One student scoffed aloud, pointing at a paragraph where Zariah described how even walls hold memory. Another raised a hand and questioned whether she understood the difference between historical harm and present-day victimhood. The words were sanitized, but the intent wasn't. It wasn't a critique. It was a slow-motion public shaming dressed in academic vocabulary. Then the whispers began, quiet at first, but insidious. She's always reaching, trying too hard to sound woke. You can't teach common sense. And then came the one she could never forget. A voice from the back, muted by distance but sharpened by hate. She got in here to fill a quota, not write a manifesto. Laughter followed, the kind that doesn't just echo at brands. Zariah's breath shallowed. Her skin burned. Not a single professor intervened. No administrator stepped in, not even the TA, who usually kept order, looked up from her notes. The message was clear. Zariah wasn't just being punished. She was being offered up. The worst part wasn't the mockery. It was the silence of those who knew better. The black students in the room, the ones who once nodded at her across dining halls or exchanged tired glances during problematic lectures, kept their heads down, eyes fixed on notebooks, on screens, on anything but her. Zariah didn't blame them, not fully. She understood the cost of solidarity. She knew they were calculating survival, not betrayal. Still, the isolation cut deep. As the class continued, dissecting her emotions as if they were thesis material, Zariah's ears rang with a high-pitched numbness. The walls felt like they were closing in, and yet, she didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat, perfectly still, watching the spectacle of her own deconstruction unfold like a rehearsed performance. By the time the screen went black and Aldridge transitioned back to the lecture, Zariah had become invisible again. The room moved on, as if nothing had happened, as if her emotional autopsy hadn't just been conducted under fluorescent lights. But not everyone was complicit. Near the back row, a white student named Keaton had sat quietly, phone in hand, recording every word. His face remained blank throughout, but behind his stillness was fury. Keaton wasn't a friend of Zariah's. They'd never spoken outside of group discussions, but he had seen enough injustice in the world to recognize institutional cruelty when it was dressed in civility. After class, Zariah left the hall with her head high, though her insides were crumbling. The moment she stepped outside, the cold air slapped her across the face like a wake-up call. Her feet carried her to the Trenton Center without thought, driven by something between rage and desperation. But as she walked, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. No message. Just a video attachment. She opened it with shaking hands and watched. It was the full recording of the class. Every smirk, every attack, every cowardly silence, captured in perfect audio and crystal clear video. Keaton's voice came through at the end in a quiet murmur. They don't deserve to control this narrative. No name, no demand, just the truth, offered freely. Zariah clutched the phone to her chest as she stepped into the shadow of the Trenton Center. Her reflection in the glass door stared back at her, not as a victim, but as a mirror. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. It was about every student who had walked into that room and left smaller than they arrived. She entered the building, the brass key tight in her fist. The hallways were empty, the lights flickering low. The staircase to the sub-basement was hidden behind a rusted maintenance door, barely noticed unless one was looking. She twisted the key in the lock. It turned with a reluctant groan. The door creaked open, revealing stairs that led into pitch black. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Keaton. A new email. No subject, just one line. We warned you. Consider this your final notice. As she descended into the forgotten basement, the overhead light snapped off and the door slammed shut behind her, locking her inside with something or someone waiting in the dark. The moment the Trenton Center basement door slammed shut behind her, Zariah knew it wasn't a mistake. She stood in the pitch-black stairwell, the cold seeping through the concrete walls as if the building itself wanted her gone. Her phone's flashlight cast a narrow cone of light, revealing a path lined with cracked steps and water stains that looked older than most buildings on campus. Her breath grew heavy, not from fear, but fury. They had locked her in. Again. Not just physically, but institutionally. And this time, it wasn't just a metaphor. She descended slowly, hand grazing the wall to stay balanced, until the staircase opened into a corridor. Old pipes jutted out from the ceiling, the air dense with mildew and secrets. Every few feet she passed rusted filing cabinets bolted shut, their drawers labeled with faded red tape. Internal staff memoirs, 1963, legacy admissions audit, 1972, and more ominously, suppressed case logs. Most were inaccessible, sealed behind padlocks or stripped of handles entirely. But in the far corner of the corridor stood a single wooden desk, half collapsed, covered in a film of dust. On top was a box. No label, no lock, just waiting. Inside were folders filled with faculty communications, emails printed on official letterhead, confidential memos, budgetary requests, and redacted documents with one name that appeared again and again: Zariah Walker. Some dated back over a year before her acceptance, before she'd even submitted her final essay. One memo marked eyes only, listed her name under a subheading, admissions watch list, high risk for narrative disruption. It hit her like a punch to the chest. She hadn't been admitted on merit alone. She had been monitored from the beginning. Above the pile sat a photo, yellowing at the edges. It was a panel of faculty, smiling in front of a university seal, except for one man on the far left, circled in red ink. Aldridge. The back of the photo read, Legacy Symposium, Trenton Donor Strategy Implementation. Strategy. That's what she had been reduced to in their internal language. Not a student, not a scholar, a strategic liability. And still, none of it made headlines. After Keaton's video leaked online, Zariah expected the response to be immediate. Outrage, apologies, institutional backpedaling. But Harvard moved faster. Before the video had even reached 1,000 views, the university's PR department flooded the press with preemptive statements. Phrases like emotional instability, disciplinary concerns, and non-academic conduct appeared in op-eds across national outlets, most written by journalists who had long-standing ties to university donors. Her social media was scrubbed clean by someone other than her, but archived tweets, angry reflections from high school, grief posts after her cousin was shot by police, were taken out of context and weaponized. They said she had a pattern of disruptive language. One editorial went as far as calling her a threat to campus harmony. Within days, donors threatened to withhold funding. One board member issued a public letter, expressing deep concern over radicalization under the guise of activism. Professors began pulling back. Once friendly faces avoided eye contact, study groups stopped inviting her. Her campus job was suddenly under review for attendance inconsistencies. She was still breathing, still showing up to class, but Zariah was being erased in real time. Digitally, socially, academically. The silence was louder than any protest. Even the black faculty, those who once praised her curiosity and invited her to speak in discussion panels, now emailed her with cold formal language. Some said nothing at all. Her messages went unanswered. Her questions met with redirections. It wasn't that they agreed with the institution, but they had seen what happened to people who spoke too loudly. They had tenure to protect, mortgages, families, and Zariah was being framed as radioactive. Still, she refused to disappear quietly. She compiled every file she had recovered from the Trenton Center basement and sent them to external academic forums. She posted the video again from anonymous accounts. She even scheduled a live stream titled Harvard's Manufactured Silence, detailing the systemic erasure of minority voices behind ivy-covered walls. But each upload was flagged, removed, or shadow banned before it reached a large audience. Her internet connection slowed mysteriously whenever she tried to upload from campus. Roman confirmed her IP had been throttled internally. One morning, her inbox contained a message from the financial aid office. Her scholarship eligibility was under review, pending a compliance audit. She had never missed a payment deadline, never violated any conditions, but the language was careful, legal, damning in implication. She showed up in person. The receptionist smiled thinly, asked her to wait, and 30 minutes later, handed her a folder. Inside was a report questioning whether her current academic trajectory aligns with Harvard's standards of excellence and community contribution. In the margin, handwritten in red, "Review pending for behavioral instability. Recommend temporary suspension." Zariah left the office and walked until her legs hurt. She wandered past the gates into the public square, sat on a bench, and stared at the statue of John Harvard. She had passed it 100 times, touched its foot once, like a tourist. Now it looked like a monument to gaslighting, a pedestal for men who had designed entire systems and called them neutral. And just as the weight threatened to break her completely, her phone buzzed. No caller ID, no name. Just a voice, calm, deliberate, older, masculine. He said he worked in administration. He didn't say his name, only that he had read everything she had written. He sounded tired, like a man who had been complicit for too long. He told her to check her email, then he hung up. Her inbox lit up moments later, with a single attachment, Silent Doctrine Confidential Briefing, internal use only. It was 87 pages long, dated 5 years earlier, marked as internal policy for narrative containment procedures. Inside were strategies for handling disruptive minority narratives, including digital throttling, scholarship reevaluation, classroom redirection, and media preemption. There were outlined procedures for character deconstruction campaigns, leaked to specific journalists, with pre-written blurbs and reaction templates. Her name appeared 3 times in predictive models. She was labeled an escalation variable. The brief even referenced a real-time evaluation system that tracked the ratio of her class participation to faculty satisfaction. The document claimed it was for performance monitoring, but every metric penalized dissent. Passion became aggression. Complexity became confusion. Silence became deviance. It wasn't incompetence. It was a system. They didn't just want to erase her voice. They wanted her to question if she ever had one. She stared at the final page of the briefing, hands trembling. It wasn't signed, but the file was stored on a private administrative server. The metadata traced back to someone with full clearance. Dean Nathaniel Graves, the same dean who once shook her hand during orientation, praised her application essay, and told her she was a breath of fresh air for the school. He had personally approved the brief. Zariah didn't flinch. She printed it, made copies, uploaded backups. The truth wasn't enough anymore. It had to be undeniable, unkillable, untwistable. As she packed up her things that evening, preparing for the storm she knew was coming, a courier knocked at her door. A thick envelope. Inside, a formal notice of academic review. She was expected at a private disciplinary hearing within 4. The envelope also included a page she hadn't seen before. A transcript of a voicemail she never received. A digitally altered message that painted her as threatening a faculty member. As she stared at the forged transcript, her phone buzzed again, this time with a name she recognized from the admin directory. A second whistleblower had come forward, and they had audio proof that the university was forging evidence. The email came just after midnight. encrypted, unsigned, and sent through a server used only by upper-tier administrators. Zariah's pulse quickened the moment she saw the name in the subject line. Camden Breyer. He wasn't just an administrative assistant or faculty member. Breyer was the university's director of academic oversight. A quiet man who once spoke with admiration about Zariah's freshman thesis, and had even nominated her for a departmental spotlight feature months ago. She remembered his warmth, his ability to quote Baldwin and Du Bois without sounding performative, and the way his office door always seemed to remain slightly open, like an invitation. Now his email said only one thing: "You need to see this. I shouldn't be sending it." The attached audio file was grainy, clipped in parts, but unmistakable in what it captured. Voices, several of them, discussing Zariah by name, not as a student, but as a liability. "She's crossing into dangerous territory," one man said. "If she connects the legacy admission data to the plantation records, this entire thing collapses." Another voice chimed in, drier, more calculated: "We need to control the narrative, contain it before it spreads beyond campus." Then came the voice that made Zariah sit completely still. It was Professor Alton Dale, the man who had once offered to co-author a research paper with her on racial bias in admissions. He had spoken at Black Student Union events, taught courses on critical race theory, and held office hours late into the night for students of color. To many, he was the face of Harvard's progressive conscience. But on the recording, his tone was clinical, cold. "If she refuses to disengage, we isolate her, reframe her tone as hostility, push for academic review. We've done it before." Zariah played the clip again, this time with headphones, as if she needed the words to pierce her deeper. The betrayal stung worse than the smearing campaigns, worse than the planted transcripts. Dale had been the one voice she thought might defend her when things spiraled, and now he was part of the mechanism pulling the strings to end her. She replied to Camden's message only with a thank you. She didn't ask why he sent it. She already knew. Not everyone inside the walls of power agreed with what was happening, but very few were willing to burn those walls down. The next day, Zariah began mapping the committee. Roman dug into faculty directories, alumni board logs, and private donations traced back to old family estates. It was slow, deliberate work. They started to see the architecture of something larger than policy, a network that wasn't listed on any org chart but operated like a private board. It was called the Stewardship Circle. Harvard publicly framed it as a benign advisory group, a collaboration of professors, trustees, and influential alumni, designed to preserve institutional excellence. But buried in the bylaws were troubling clauses, permissions that allowed them to review critical campus narratives and advise corrective cultural realignments. The committee had broad access to student files. They met off record, and they had an entire system for flagging students who posed what they called legacy destabilization threats. Zariah wasn't the first. There had been others, brilliant, defiant students whose voices had grown too loud. Each time the institution responded with rehearsed concern, bureaucratic compassion, and eventually silence. But Zariah had something those other students didn't: proof. She documented every voice in the recording, matched the speakers to their university profiles, and compiled it into a single report titled The Stewardship Playbook. She saved it on encrypted drives and scheduled email leaks in case anything happened to her. She didn't want martyrdom. She wanted exposure. Still, the more she learned, the more dangerous the game became. The committee had influence far beyond campus. Alumni on the panel controlled media outlets, hedge funds, and national think tanks. They had entire departments loyal to them. They could rewrite her story before she ever finished telling it. But Zariah had reached a point beyond fear. She was fueled now by something else: ancestral defiance, the kind passed down through generations of survival, through Lillian and Mavis, through every woman in her bloodline who had served systems that denied them dignity. And yet nothing prepared her for what she uncovered next. In one archived internal memo from a decade ago, she found mention of the Quiet Program, a discretionary initiative under the Stewardship Circle. Its purpose to offer alternative pathways to problematic students. Some were offered jobs in far-off places. Others were awarded sudden fellowships that relocated them mid-semester. It was soft exile, removal without scandal, an invisible purge. The memo also included a line she couldn't forget: containment must appear benevolent. The subject must feel as though they chose to leave. That same week, Zariah received an invitation to apply for an exclusive postgraduate fellowship in Geneva, fully funded, fast-tracked, no interview required. It would mean safety, distance, A clean exit. She deleted the email. Later that night, her name vanished from the online student directory. Her student login failed. Campus printers denied her access. She was still physically present, but institutionally deleted. Roman tried to reset her access credentials, but every attempt returned a message. No user found. Even the financial aid office claimed there was no record of her enrollment. She was being erased in real time. That's when her phone rang again. This time not a stranger. The caller ID read, Alton Dale. Her fingers trembled, not from fear but from disbelief. She answered. The voice on the line was calm. He told her he wanted to meet, that things had gone too far, that perhaps there was room for resolution. He asked her to come alone. Zariah agreed. But she didn't go alone. Roman waited outside the meeting spot, laptop ready, phone recording. They met in Dale's office after hours. He poured tea, smiled the way he used to, apologized for how things had unfolded, said he had once believed change could come from within, but learned too late how power seduced even the best of them. Then he handed her a folder. Inside were more documents, proof that the committee had pushed for her rejection initially, then reversed course only when her essay on the myth of academic neutrality caught attention from a wealthy black donor. Her admission had never been merit. It had been calculation. But Dale didn't hand her the file out of guilt. He had an offer, a full pardon, her scholarship reinstated, public support, on one condition: she withdraw her complaints, delete her posts, and accept a special research position next semester with a script, a guided thesis, and institutional oversight. It was a trade, her voice, for their redemption. Zariah stared at him, every nerve in her body on fire. He thought this was mercy. He thought this was compromise. But she'd already made her choice weeks ago when they first questioned her ability to read. She stood up, folder in hand, and left. Hours later, the university sent a cease and desist letter, not just to her, but to Keaton and Roman, and included one shocking addition. Her mother had been contacted by legal counsel, and was now under review for misuse of university-sponsored family resources. The committee was taking the fight beyond campus. The cease and desist letter arrived like a scalpel, sharp, precise, and deeply personal. It wasn't just directed at Zariah, but at the two people closest to her movement. Roman, who had risked everything to expose the surveillance systems behind Harvard's walls, and Keaton, whose viral video had cracked open the carefully managed silence. But what made her stomach twist wasn't her name or theirs. It was the line buried halfway through the letter, printed in cold legal language. Cassandra Walker, mother of the accused, has been identified as a recipient of misappropriated university communications, and is now subject to institutional review, under Title IV subsection compliance. Her mother, a school cafeteria worker, back in Ohio, a woman who still walked 2 miles to work every morning, in worn sneakers, because she refused to let poverty dictate her dignity. Cassandra had never stepped foot on Harvard's campus. She'd only ever sent care packages, soft-scented lotions, food Zariah missed, handwritten prayers, folded into books. Now she was being targeted, threatened with legal action, by an institution her ancestors had once served under duress. It was no longer about academic retaliation. It was warfare. Harvard wasn't trying to silence Zariah anymore. They were trying to humiliate her into compliance by dragging her bloodline back into submission. And yet, even in the thick of betrayal, one person still lingered in Zariah's mind: Dr. Malcolm Bennett. The charismatic bow-tie-wearing professor who had once made her believe change could come from within. He was the first faculty member to read her entrance essay out loud during a departmental mixer, the one who gave her a signed copy of The Fire Next Time, scribbling inside, "You are the storm they pretend they don't hear coming." For months he had walked with her through every intellectual debate, challenging her gently, mentoring her fiercely. When the campus turned cold, she assumed he had gone quiet to protect her. She waited, gave him grace. But the grace ran out when she learned the truth. In one of the documents leaked by Camden, there it was, Bennett's name in the meeting logs of the stewardship circle. Not a guest, not a bystander, a full voting member. And beside his name in the minutes of a confidential meeting, Walker, advise caution, potential PR asset if redirected, unstable long-term, charisma high, risk higher, diversity grenade waiting to blow. Zariah reread the line until her hands went numb. The man who had spoken Baldwin into her bones had reduced her to a statistic with a fuse. It wasn't just betrayal. It was desecration. She requested a private appointment, under the pretense of discussing her suspended research grant. He accepted, still polite, still gracious in tone. When she entered his office, sunlight poured through his window like nothing outside had crumbled. Bookshelves stood in neat order, academic awards framed with quiet pride. He greeted her like nothing was broken. She didn't smile, didn't sit. She placed the document on his desk and waited. Bennett's eyes scanned the page. He didn't flinch, didn't deny, just sighed, as if the burden of complicity were heavier than the consequences of what it carried. He leaned back and spoke in a voice softer than she expected. He said he had fought for her at first, that he had believed in her work, her mind, her courage. But the moment she began challenging the structure itself, his faith had become a liability. He confessed to voting for her containment, but not punishment. Said he wanted to redirect her brilliance into something sustainable. His words were filled with self-preserving kindness, not cruelty, but they gutted her all the same. He said the quiet part out loud, that institutions don't survive by changing, but by rebranding, and that students like her could either become a marketing symbol or disappear. Zariah felt the ground shift under her. This wasn't just a betrayal by a mentor. It was a reminder that the rot wasn't just in conservatives, in bigots, in those openly hostile to her existence. The rot lived in the soft-spoken men who taught Baldwin, but feared revolution, in the professors who used phrases like racial uplift, while sitting on panels designed to suffocate it. Dr. Bennett had played the role of ally so well he'd forgotten he wasn't one. She asked him only one question before leaving. She asked whether he would go public, admit what he had done, expose the committee, tell the truth. He looked at her with sorrow, maybe even guilt, and said he couldn't. That it would end his career, discredit the very work he'd tried to do for marginalized students. Zariah stared at him, and in that moment, she saw it clearly. He hadn't betrayed her in a moment. He had built his reputation off students like her for years. Their stories, their struggles, their brilliance, used them as mirrors to reflect his own virtue. And when one mirror shattered, he simply turned to another. She walked out without a word. That evening, a new message appeared in her inbox. It was from an internal student account. Anonymous, brief, just a line of text, followed by a link. If you want the real reason they're coming for you, read the Trenton Fellowship Archive. Zariah clicked. The link led to a locked university archive, restricted to only 5 logins. She bypassed it using Roman's VPN tunnel. Inside was a digital vault of documents marked Trenton Fellowship Program, Beneficiary Selection Protocol. Zariah's eyes scanned the screen. There were years of files, selection logs, criteria, donor agreements, and then she saw her own name listed, not as a scholarship recipient, but as a case study. One sentence stood out. Admission approved as part of longitudinal behavior analysis of high-achieving minority resistance under duress. She wasn't just a student. She had been enrolled as data. Her every move recorded, her reactions mapped, her responses evaluated for future policy experiments. Even her admission essay, the one that had moved so many, was highlighted not for its strength, but for its potential escalation markers. They had never wanted her to succeed. They had wanted her to break beautifully, publicly, measurably. At the bottom of the archive folder, a final document appeared. Exit Strategy Protocol, ZW Classified. It was timestamped for the following week, and included details for an academic withdrawal that she had never requested. Zariah didn't sleep the night before she released the audio. She stared at the file on her screen for hours, listening over and over, as Dr. Bennett calmly dismantled her future in clinical self-preserving language. She could hear the weight of institutional rot beneath every syllable. He hadn't raged. He hadn't cursed. He had quietly, strategically packaged her identity into something manageable, something to contain. That, she realized, was why it had to be public, not just to expose him, but to force a reckoning with the illusion of allyship that protected institutions more than truth ever could. At precisely 7:03 a.m., she uploaded the recording to 3 platforms under mirrored burner accounts. She included no caption, no explanation, only a title: Fake Ally, Exposed, Harvard Professor Caught Sabotaging Black Student. She tagged no names. She let the voice speak for itself. It took 42 minutes for the clip to go viral. By the time she walked across the yard to her first class, her name had already trended on 3 platforms. Her face, half lit from a past campus profile photo, was now plastered across headlines, hashtags, and outrage-fueled video reactions. Some responses were immediate and supportive. Students of color across other campuses began stitching their own stories beneath hers, recounting mentors who had turned the same way Bennett had. Black scholars began citing her as a living case study in systemic betrayal. Hashtags multiplied. Diversity token exposed. Academia unmasked. Harvard silences. But the celebration came wrapped in danger. By noon, Zariah's phone had crashed twice under the weight of messages. Journalists emailed relentlessly. Requests poured in for interviews, speaking gigs, op-eds. She hadn't even had a chance to breathe. And then, the backlash began. Anonymous accounts leaked her high school photos. A 10-second clip of her laughing at a protest completely removed from context surfaced with captions framing her as aggressive, disrespectful, and anti-institution. Her childhood address was posted in a comment thread. Her mother's Facebook profile disappeared under a wave of harassment. Roman received a phone call with no caller ID. When he answered, the voice on the other end said only, "You've chosen the wrong storm." Zariah didn't flinch, not publicly. She kept posting, not emotionally, strategically. She timed her posts for maximum visibility, released screenshots in batches, dropped her findings like chapters in a slow-burning novel that no one could stop reading. She published side-by-side comparisons of internal documents and public statements, titled each Lies versus Reality. She exposed the Trenton Fellowship archive one document at a time, ensuring no single leak could be dismissed. It wasn't vengeance, it was surgery, and the institution was hemorrhaging. The university scrambled to respond. First came the statements dripping in neutrality. We are looking into the matter. We uphold the highest standards of integrity. We encourage dialogue, not division. Then came the vague gestures. A review panel, an upcoming listening session, a university-sanctioned forum on restorative academic practices. Zariah watched it all from a distance, her inbox bursting with half-baked apologies from faculty who had once ghosted her emails. Even students who had whispered behind her back now sent DMs saying they stood with her. She didn't need their approval, but she would use their attention. She scheduled a campus event, an open forum titled What Harvard Won't Teach You. Flyers appeared overnight on every bulletin board, in bathrooms, under doors. Within 24 hours, the RSVP list passed 600 names. The administration sent a notice saying the event was unauthorized. Roman built a live stream channel and made it public. Everything was moving fast, and still something didn't sit right. One night, after returning from a strategy meeting with off-campus allies, Zariah found a plain manila envelope slipped beneath her dorm room door. No stamp, no name. Inside was a single sheet of old parchment, aged brittle, and clearly pulled from deep archival storage. On it was a map, hand-sketched in charcoal ink, labeled in cursive, Subterranean Access Map, Crimson District. It showed a network of tunnels beneath the university, hallways that connected dormitories to faculty homes, administration buildings to research vaults. At the bottom of the page, one room was marked with a red X. It sat beneath a building long since repurposed as an alumni center. Attached to the map was a single note, printed in precise serif font. Before they rewrote the story, it was all kept here. Zariah stared at the paper, heart thudding with both dread and clarity. She had been exposing the visible structures of power. Now someone was pointing her toward the hidden ones. This wasn't just about a betrayal. It was about a buried history. She knew she couldn't go alone. That night, she met with Roman and Keaton in a corner booth of a pizza place just off campus, one of the few places without surveillance tied to university systems. They studied the map under dim light, traced the paths, circled the red. Roman cross-referenced the layout with a floor plan he found buried in old maintenance logs. The tunnel was real. The entrance point, however, had been sealed for decades, at least officially. Keaton pulled up archived blueprints. There it was. Foundation Storage Unit B, converted into event overflow storage, after a fire 20 years ago. But the structural scans showed no fire damage, just a door that had never been reopened. Zariah leaned in, her voice low and unshaken. She wasn't just going to expose corruption, she was going to unearth it physically. The next night, they met near the maintenance entrance of the Alumni Center. Roman had picked the lock. Keaton stood watch. Zariah descended into the darkness with a flashlight in one hand and her recorder in the other. The air changed instantly. It wasn't just cold, it was still. The walls were lined with pipes and forgotten cables, but it wasn't the infrastructure that caught her eye. It was the etchings, scratched into concrete, carved with nails or keys, Or maybe just desperate fingers. Names, dates, messages. We were here. Don't let them erase us. They'll call you angry. Be louder. Her breath caught in her throat. These weren't just utility tunnels. They were memory vaults. And she hadn't been the first to search for truth down here. Others had walked these halls, resisted in silence, been buried by history. She reached the room marked on the map. The door was rusted shut, but a few strong pushes sent it groaning open. Inside was a filing cabinet, charred at the edges, as if someone had tried to burn it but failed. Boxes lined the walls labeled with years, names, departments. But one box was set apart, labeled only, Evidence. Do not transfer. Zariah opened it. Inside were transcripts, handwritten letters, old cassette tapes, a ledger titled Admissions Adjustments, Legacy and Diversity. She flipped through the names. Some matched current faculty. Others were from families with buildings named after them. One folder had her own name on it, dated a full year before her application. It wasn't a coincidence. It was all orchestrated. Zariah realized she wasn't part of a failed experiment. She was the experiment, and this box was the proof. As she packed the documents, Roman's voice echoed from down the corridor. His footsteps fast, voice low. Zariah, someone's coming, and they're not alone. The concrete corridor echoed with hurried footsteps, but the rhythm was wrong. Too many steps, too little hesitation. Roman's voice, breathless but focused, cut through the cold tunnel air. Zariah, someone's coming, and they're not alone. She didn't respond. Her hands were buried in a box labeled Evidence. Do not transfer, still pulling files that vibrated with decades of silence and suppressed memory. Keaton yanked open a second box near the back of the vault room, revealing reel tapes sealed in wax envelopes. A handwritten note inside one of them read, Student Council, 1968 protest recordings, sealed per request of admin oversight. The ink bled at the edges, as if time itself had tried to erase it. Zariah's flashlight skimmed the box's interior walls. A sticker read Restricted Archive Division, Crimson Integrity Room, access revoked. This wasn't just forgotten history. This was deliberately hidden truth. The tunnel reeked of mildew and dust-coated betrayal. Rusted file drawers sat half open, their contents spilling onto the concrete. Names long vanished from campus rosters were etched into the backs of manila folders. Each document felt like a whisper, a confession left to decay. Pages listed disciplinary hearings from the civil rights era, not for violence, not for misconduct, but for tone, dress code deviation, failure to respect institutional legacy. One folder held letters written by a black student named Jonah C. Rhodes, a Harvard undergrad in 1966, expelled after publishing an expose in a Boston paper about racially biased scholarship disbursement. His letters were eloquent, unflinching, and heartbreaking. In one he wrote, You build your ivory towers on the bones of our brilliance. But we remember, even if you refuse to write it down. Zariah's fingers shook as she read his words. They echoed her present, almost word for word. The same playbook, the same silencing. The only thing that changed was the year. Roman darted inside, eyes scanning the room as he slammed the door behind him. 3 of them. Suits. They're not students. He pulled out his laptop, already hacking into the Wi-Fi blind spots mapped from old maintenance records. They're sweeping the west corridor. We've got less than 5 minutes. Keaton had gone pale. We can't carry everything. Zariah didn't answer. She opened one last drawer. Inside was a leather-bound register, dust-covered, cracked at the spine. The front read, Student Anomalies and Faculty Liaison Report. It wasn't a log, it was a ledger. One side recorded students by name, race, GPA, behavioral compatibility score. The other recorded notes from professors. Too combative, excessive pride, challenges white narratives. Red stars marked those flagged for monitoring. Double stars marked those escalated for removal. Nearly every starred name was black or brown. It was data-backed discrimination, disguised as institutional analysis. Roman cursed under his breath as his laptop screen flickered. They're running signal scramblers. I can't stream this out. Zariah's eyes darted to the camera, tucked in her hoodie. Still recording, but if they lost the files down here, it wouldn't matter. Truth without proof was just another denied accusation. Suddenly, a creak echoed from the hallway, metal scraping against metal. Not footsteps, a lock being twisted open. Zariah motioned for silence, her heart pounding against her ribs like a gavel. They turned off their lights. Only the dim glow from Roman's laptop cast flickering shadows. Time slowed. Every sound grew louder. The hum of old wires. The drip of condensation. The sharp rustle of a page shifting beneath her foot. Then, just beyond the vault's doorframe, came the unmistakable voice of a man. "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't yelled. It wasn't panicked. It was quiet. Calculated. Zariah stepped into the doorway, her face still shrouded in shadow. The man stood about 10 feet away, tall, gray-suited, holding a clipboard like it was armor. His voice carried the weight of administrative authority, unflinching. "Cole, you've breached university property. This is not an authorized archive." Zariah raised her chin. "It's not archived. It's buried. And I've just unburied it." His eyes flicked to the box in her hands. "That material is classified." "By who?" she snapped. "By people who committed the crimes in the first place." Roman and Keaton moved behind her, documents stuffed into their backpacks. The man didn't blink. "There's a protocol for students who wander. I suggest you cooperate." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. And Zariah recognized it. It was the same tone Bennett used before asking her to choose sustainability, the same tone Aldridge used before projecting her private blog in class. The tone of quiet violence. She stepped forward, the box still clutched against her chest. "You're going to walk away. Because if you don't, this room, this tunnel, these files, they become a live stream in 30 seconds. Roman nodded, pretending to adjust his camera while uploading encrypted data packets into a shadow folder on the dark web. The man took a breath. He didn't argue. He didn't move. He just said, "Then you've chosen your path," and disappeared back into the dark. The silence that followed was unbearable. Keaton finally spoke. "We need to go. Now." They moved fast, retracing the map's route, darting through narrow hallways lined with rusting pipes and peeling university crests. Zariah carried the ledger, clutched tightly like scripture. Roman held the tapes. Keaton had 3 folders stuffed into his jacket, including the Jonah C. Rhodes file. As they reached the old maintenance stairwell leading back to the surface, Keaton paused. He turned to Zariah. "Do you feel it?" She frowned. "Feel what?" He pointed upward. And then they all heard it. The sound of voices, muffled but growing louder. Not from the tunnel behind them, but from the floor above. Dozens of them. Chanting. Marching. Zariah pushed open the stairwell door, and the hallway above exploded with sound. Students. Everywhere. Flooding the building. Carrying signs. Phones. Some had printed the hashtag buried truth. Others held up photos of Zariah, side by side with archive letters and redacted files. Keaton looked stunned. "How did they?" Roman turned his laptop around. The live stream had failed, but the data hadn't. Their backup plan, automated upload to a student-led news server, had worked. They were already trending. Zariah stepped into the light, and the crowd parted for her like she was both survivor and proof. But the celebration would have to wait. Her phone buzzed. A blocked number. Again. She picked up. A voice muffled and breathless spoke only one sentence. The vault wasn't the end. They kept a second room, and it's not on any map. The truth she thought she'd uncovered was only one layer, and the next one was designed never to be found. Zariah stood at the edge of the stairwell, the weight of the crowd's chants still echoing behind her. But her attention locked on the whisper that had come through the phone. A second vault. One that wasn't on any map. One that had remained hidden even from the most rebellious students, the most defiant alumni, the most meticulous archivists. It wasn't the end. It was deeper, older, designed to disappear. The moment the voice had gone silent, the call terminated itself. No trace of the number. No metadata. A ghost transmission. And yet, everything in her gut told her it was real. Back inside the tunnel system, the air had shifted. As Roman, Keaton, and Zariah made their way down a narrow extension of the routes they had followed earlier, the corridor grew narrower, the dust thicker, the pipes coated in silence. This wasn't part of the official blueprint. The concrete here looked older, textured with time and wear, and the brick behind it bore symbols that had been long chiseled away. At the far end, past a grated hallway half blocked by collapsed ductwork, they found it. Not a steel door, not a panel, but a wall that didn't match the rest. A different stone, newer, poorly matched in color. Zariah pressed her palm against it and felt a slight give. Roman pulled out a portable light and scanned the edge of the floor, barely visible. A set of grooves curved like hinges, hidden beneath a smear of industrial paint. This wasn't just sealed, it was disguised. Behind the wall, after 20 minutes of prying and wrenching, they found a hidden chamber. Inside, the air was impossibly dry. It had the quiet of a place forgotten not by accident, but by design. There was no dust, no decay, just silence. And stories. The room was smaller than the first vault, but more focused. Each item had been intentionally preserved. On one wall hung a row of photographs. Black students in caps and gowns, smiling against backdrops of protest banners. Names written in cursive beneath them had been crossed out in red pen. In the corner was a crate of reel-to-reel film labeled unfertilized footage, not for academic circulation. Zariah opened the nearest box. Inside were handmade flyers from 1971. "We are not your diversity. Our tuition isn't acceptance. Harvard was built on our blood. It will not bury our voices." The slogans felt timeless, not because they were outdated, but because they still fit. The second crate contained letters, some typed, others handwritten, each addressed to the administration, pleading for recognition, for justice. Expelled students, silenced speakers, scholars whose names were removed from research credits after they spoke out about racism in syllabi, in hiring, in housing, and beneath it all, journals, dozens of them, each labeled by year, each filled with the unfiltered emotions of students who had stood in the same place. Zariah now stood, marginalized, monitored, manipulated. Their words weren't academic. They were raw, vivid, furious. One entry read, "They told me if I changed my tone, they'd listen, but my voice is not a weapon. It's a wound they're afraid to admit they caused." Zariah's hands trembled as she realized she wasn't standing on new ground. She was standing on sacred ground. Her fight wasn't novel, it was inherited. And every time the cycle had repeated, every generation had risen, had screamed, had documented, and every time, Harvard buried them. Literally. Roman uncovered a projector, powered by an old battery system. Against the far wall, he played one of the reel films. The black and white footage flickered into motion. It showed a student sit-in from the night, dozens of black students occupying the president's office, their mouths covered in tape, their signs bold, and then the response: uniformed security, university staff dragging students out, some with their eyes swollen, their belongings tossed into hallways. None of this footage had ever seen light. It had never been part of the historical tours, the alumni documentaries, the glossy admission reels. These weren't moments Harvard commemorated. These were scars it refused to show. Zariah's eyes welled, not out of sadness, but defiance. These students had been erased, yet here they were, immortalized in the dark, waiting to be found, waiting for someone to carry their truth forward. She moved to the back corner of the chamber, drawn by a small filing cabinet, barely waist-high. Unlike the others, it was locked with a reinforced clasp. Roman used a pocket tool to snap it open. Inside were only 5 folders. The last one bore her name. Zariah opened it slowly. Her heart stuttered. The file was dated 6 months before her admission letter had even been issued. Inside was a psychological assessment, notes on her social media, academic behavior, debate performances, even public speaking events from her high school years. There were annotations: high potential for disruption, charismatic risk vector, possible asset if redirected. It was clear. Zariah hadn't been admitted in spite of her outspokenness. She had been admitted because of it. To study, to monitor, to test containment strategies. She wasn't just an experiment. She was a field case. Roman and Keaton stared at the pages in disbelief. But Zariah just stood still. A different kind of stillness. Not paralysis. Preparation. They had tried to trap her, but they had also handed her every piece of their plan. And she was no longer playing defense. In the far wall of the chamber, they noticed a small ventilation grate. Roman scanned it with a thermal device. It revealed a warm current, meaning it was connected to a currently used building, possibly the administration wing. They mapped the exit route, but before they could move, the door they'd pried open creaked behind them. A voice filtered through, not shouting, not rushed. Calm. Too calm. "I hope you understand," it said. This place was never meant to be reopened. It was Camden, the same administrator who had leaked her the audio files. But something in his voice was different now. Not allied, not warning. Something else. Zariah stepped into the doorframe, narrowing her eyes. He stood there alone, but his presence didn't feel solitary. Camden didn't look shaken. He looked resigned. And then he spoke again, this time more directly. I didn't send you that map. Zariah's mind froze. Keaton whispered behind her, confused. Roman started checking the upload signal, backing up files silently. Camden continued, voice measured. I wasn't the one who unlocked this room. I thought it was sealed. I only came because I got the same message you did. Zariah's breath caught. Someone else had orchestrated this. Someone who wanted the vault found. And now, all of them had walked into it, unaware of what was still waiting in the shadows. As Camden stepped aside, a motion sensor inside the chamber blinked red, and from the ceiling above them, a hidden surveillance camera whirred to life, silently broadcasting everything they had just uncovered to someone watching far above. The hum of the hidden surveillance camera overhead was almost imperceptible, but Zariah felt it like a pulse behind her ribs. She didn't move, didn't speak, her entire body locked into awareness as the red light blinked in rhythmic silence. Someone had been watching, not just the vault's contents, but her discovery, her reaction, her pain. She turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing on the lens. It wasn't fear that washed over her. It was calculation. Whoever was behind that feed had just witnessed the unmasking of the institution's deepest route, and her breaking point, or what they thought would be her breaking point. Roman glanced at the blinking light, his face paling. Keaton shifted closer to the entrance, instinctively checking for movement down the corridor, and Camden, still standing in the threshold, looked like a man who had wandered into a room not meant for him, and suddenly realized the floor wasn't made of stone, but of glass, ready to shatter. Zariah stepped away from the file marked with her name. It no longer felt like a folder. It felt like a mirror. She thought she'd known betrayal, thought she'd traced the depth of this system's sickness when she saw her grandmother's labor in the school's foundations, when Aldridge mocked her in class, when Bennett chose silence over truth. But this was beyond betrayal. It was orchestration. The admission letter she had once held in trembling, grateful hands now felt like a trapdoor. The glowing words of welcome, the scholarships, the access. It had never been recognition. It had been recruitment. She wasn't invited to Harvard to thrive. She was enlisted to be studied. The documents spelled it out in clinical detachment, behavioral study cohort, urban minority resistance models. Her file was labeled ZW05. Roman discovered a list of names in an adjacent folder. 5 others. All black, all high-achieving. 3 had transferred. 1 had withdrawn after a public disciplinary hearing. The 5th, his name was redacted entirely. Each file tracked responses to microaggressions, classroom pressure, academic gaslighting, and institutional neglect. One note on Zariah's timeline read, "Subject demonstrates high resistance to emotional manipulation. Escalation may be required to test boundaries of defiance." She stood still, but inside her chest, something primal ignited. Not rage alone, something sharper, cold, intentional. They hadn't just watched her fight for dignity. They had measured it. Roman backed up the files quickly, uploading them into a secure database before wiping the system logs. Camden finally stepped into the chamber, hands half raised as if he no longer trusted his own innocence. He claimed he hadn't known, claimed he thought the program was defunct, but Zariah barely heard him. Her ears rang with the memory of every professor who had doubted her tone, every counselor who redirected her ambition, every anonymous email that warned her to stop digging. All of it had been expected, forecasted, tracked. Her resilience wasn't her own. It had been recorded like a data stream, waiting to be processed. They left the chamber quietly, sealing the door behind them, taking only what mattered, proof. But even as the tunnel swallowed them in shadow, Zariah knew they were no longer unseen. Whoever had been watching had everything they needed now, including her face. Back above ground, the campus had shifted again, not physically but in energy. People stared longer. Conversations paused when she passed. Phones lifted toward her like mirrors made of glass and judgment. She logged into her encrypted email and found the link before Roman could warn her. The camera feed from the vault, her moment of discovery, the tremble in her voice, the devastation in her eyes, had been leaked. No headline, no watermark, just the raw footage uploaded to a burner account on multiple platforms. It was titled "How They Really See Us: Harvard's Hidden Experiment." Within minutes, it was everywhere. Thousands of views. Then hundreds of thousands. The clip was dissected, debated, repurposed by everyone from social justice activists to conservative pundits. Some called her a hero. Others accused her of fabricating outrage. Think pieces bloomed like weeds. Weaponized identity or institutional abuse. The fine line between scholarship and surveillance. Is Harvard gaslighting its students of color? But beneath the noise, the truth spread like wildfire. Screenshots from her admissions file. The behavioral study logs. The list of redacted student IDs. The terms Dadui05 began trending. Zariah sat in her room, the blinds shut tight, her face lit only by the glow of the screen, as she watched her own unraveling be turned into entertainment. Her trauma, her dignity, her resilience, repackaged as spectacle. She was viral now, but not on her own terms. The footage was never meant to be public. Someone inside the system had chosen to leak it. But why? Roman found something buried in the metadata of the file. A signature embedded in the upload. One that didn't belong to administration or faculty. It belonged to a student, one of the redacted names on the cohort list. ZW02. The second test subject. Someone else who had been studied. Someone who had disappeared, but clearly not gone. They had watched her, tracked her, and now helped her. Zariah's hands trembled as she connected the dots. She wasn't just the story now. She was part of a long chain of students, targeted, tested, silenced, and some, like ZW02, who had learned how to survive inside the machine. A message arrived moments later, from a blank sender. No greeting, no farewell, just one sentence. They think you've peaked, let them. Then another message followed, an address. Off campus, abandoned decades ago, but listed in the original documents as the off-site records storage for the very committee that started the experiment. By dawn, the footage from the vault had been stitched into news segments, podcasts, digital panels, and TikTok think pieces. It wasn't just trending, it had ignited a national reckoning. Across cities and campuses, the video of Zariah discovering she'd been profiled and monitored as part of a covert behavioral study was no longer just her story, it was America's mirror. In front of Harvard's historic gates, students flooded the sidewalk with handmade signs, live stream setups, and microphone stands. Voices rose in chants that hadn't been heard on campus since the Vietnam War era. Only now, they weren't demanding foreign policy reform. They were demanding truth, demanding justice for every name erased from the university's books, for every file that had once been marked "Do Not Transfer." Some held up blown-up screenshots of her redacted file. Others carried quotes from the hidden journals she'd unearthed. Phrases scrawled decades ago by forgotten black students, now resurrected as rallying cries. "They silenced me, but they didn't stop me," was painted across the steps of the alumni hall. But while the public roared, Harvard sat in practiced, polished silence. The administration didn't hold a press conference. No public disciplinary actions. No resignations. Instead, they deployed their old playbook, quiet meetings behind closed doors, and carefully worded statements that said everything and nothing at once. The university's official response landed mid-morning. As a press release, "We take these allegations seriously and are initiating a review process to determine the validity and context of these claims. Harvard remains committed to fostering an inclusive academic environment." No admission, no accountability, and most telling of all, no mention of Zariah by name. Instead, the administration pushed forward a familiar strategy: elevation of image over truth. They staged a sudden campus forum on the future of race and belonging in academia, inviting carefully selected faculty and alumni to participate. The keynote speaker was Dean Raquel Ellison, the highest-ranking black administrator at Harvard, who had only weeks earlier been sidelined in budget discussions. Now she was front and center, holding the institution's shame like a branding tool. Her speech was poised, articulate, and painfully diplomatic. She referenced the complexity of institutional healing, the need for multi-stakeholder engagement, and moving forward together. She never once named the experiment, never once said the word surveillance, and never once said Zariah. To the cameras it looked like progress. A black woman leading a conversation about racial harm, but to Zariah watching from her dorm room, while nursing 3 hours of sleep and a migraine of emotion, it felt like betrayal in a blazer. Harvard wasn't apologizing. It was rebranding. They had weaponized visibility. Again, this time not by silencing, but by absorbing her fight into their messaging machine. And Raquel Ellison, whether willingly or under pressure, had become the face of that machine. Roman paced the hallway outside her room, fielding media calls from journalists who wanted to humanize the story. One editor asked if Zariah could cry on camera. Another asked if she could walk past a lecture hall and pause like she was in pain. Keaton had already been contacted by a documentary crew. None of them wanted the truth.
They wanted a performance.
But Zariah didn't perform pain. She turned it into evidence. She printed every document again, highlighted every timestamp, created an open-source digital library, and dropped it online with one link. Harvard didn't create me, but they tried to control me. Within an hour, the server crashed under traffic. By the next morning, student protests had spread to other Ivy League schools. Yale, Princeton, Columbia, even Stanford. Across state lines, across time zones, students were sharing stories of being flagged, surveilled, monitored for tone, fit, or emotional maturity. The scale of it was staggering. What had happened to Zariah wasn't an anomaly. It was a model, a framework, a pattern of polished racism, hidden beneath phrases like academic excellence, institutional alignment, and legacy culture. And then, as if the tipping point had finally been reached, the Department of Education announced a federal civil rights investigation. For the first time, Harvard's silence wasn't strategic. It was fearful, but just as Zariah allowed herself to breathe, to believe that maybe, just maybe, there would be justice, Roman burst through her door, laptop in hand. He had been digging through public records, court filings, and digital archives on every name tied to the secret committee known as the Stewardship Circle. One name appeared again: Philip Wexler, former DOJ analyst, now listed as the lead federal investigator for the newly announced civil rights inquiry. Roman's eyes darkened as he scrolled. Wexler wasn't just a government man. He was a Harvard graduate, class of legacy family. His father had once chaired the very committee, now under federal scrutiny. Zariah's breath caught. The same system that had designed her admission as an experiment now had one of its architects leading the investigation. It wasn't an investigation. It was containment. Again, a way to close the loop. Appear responsive, while burying the truth under official paperwork. Zariah stared at the screen as Wexler's face filled the page, white, polished, professional. In old press clippings, he had once been photographed shaking hands with a Harvard president at an alumni gala. In one article, he had praised his father's unwavering commitment to Harvard's legacy and institutional excellence. Her blood boiled. They had turned accountability into theater. Again, Zariah turned to the board she had plastered with notes, names, strings connecting scandals to policy to funding trails. She had enough evidence to burn this all down, but now she needed strategy. They didn't fear truth. They feared uncontainable truth. Truth that couldn't be filtered through committees, softened by PR, or neutralized by well-spoken allies. She needed to bypass all of it. No more interviews. No more staged panels. She had something better. The second location, the abandoned records facility, listed in the original committee files, still waited. She hadn't told anyone where it was. Not Roman, not Keaton, not even Camden. Whatever had been too volatile to store on campus had been moved there. She was going to that facility, alone. She would take every risk, because what she found there might not just dismantle the university's defenses, it might shatter the federal shield protecting them. As she packed a flashlight and the original cohort list, her phone buzzed with one final message from the anonymous sender known only as ZW. If you open that door, be ready to disappear. When Zariah entered the federal courthouse that morning, she felt every pair of eyes on her, hundreds of strangers, reporters with blinking cameras, members of the legal team, spectators, activists, and a courtroom staff bound by solemn silence. The air inside smelled faintly of old carpet and varnished wood, like a theater built for performances of justice. For Zariah, it was the stage she never asked for, but the one she now commanded. From the very first minute, the proceedings were a tempest. The lawyers for the institution stood firm and unhurried, like actors reciting lines from a well-rehearsed play. They didn't deny the documents she had uncovered. Instead, they reinterpreted them, reframed them. What she called profiling, they called behavioral research under institutional guidelines. What she called surveillance, they called campus safety oversight. When the admissions file labeled her a test subject in a behavioral cohort, they claimed it had been an outdated pilot program, long since discontinued. The era was over, the protocol void. They presented counter-evidence. Select testimonials from past students who had no recollection of any behavioral experiment. One law firm expert cited outdated definitions of diversity funding, insisting that any mention of minority recruitment data referred only to statistical contingency, not individual psychological tracking. They argued that the leaked files, the vault contents, The ledger, the secret tunnels were unauthorized materials, possibly forged or tampered with. They urged the court to question the chain of custody, the legitimacy of the evidence, and the motives behind the leak. In the face of it all, Zariah stood still. She didn't falter. In her mind, she replayed the cold files, the smell of the basement, the faces on the old protest flyers, the reel-to-reel footage of student sit-ins. She thought of her grandmother's name scrawled in 1849 as a servant, and her own in that vault file as a laboratory subject. She felt the weight of centuries on her shoulders, not as burden but as responsibility. When it was her turn, she walked to the witness stand with quiet determination. Her memory wasn't rehearsed. It was carved deep from the truth. She recounted evidence, not to gain sympathy, but to demand accountability. She described the hidden tunnels, the sealed vaults, the artifacts of erased voices, the behavioral study logs, the archived protests, the ledger marking students, not by academic performance, but by social threat potential. She described the moment she realized she was not a student of merit, but a variable in a sociological experiment. As she spoke, cameras panned, faces hardened, some shifting with discomfort. The opposing counsel tried to destabilize her by reading selectively from her grandmother's old estate records, implying that her lineage, now exposed, was being exploited for scandal. They pointed to a distant relative accused of petty theft decades ago. Nothing relevant, but relevant enough to sway delicate perceptions. They tried to attach stigma to her bloodline, to frame her as unstable, a product of historical disadvantage, and therefore an unreliable witness. But the courtroom did not erupt in gasps as some had predicted. Instead, it sank into a hush, so thick Zariah could hear her own heartbeat. She didn't cower. She didn't cry. She held their gaze, even when her voice trembled. Once, just slightly, at the memory of a student beaten during a peaceful 1960s sit-in, shown earlier in archival footage. Her pain was present, but it didn't steal her strength. If anything, it sharpened it. Outside the courtroom, as the legal eagles whispered behind closed doors, the gallery reacted first. There were gasps, sharp, involuntary, then silence, then slowly, applause, not the polite claps of token recognition, but raw, real, from people who had heard the truth and understood its weight. Students, activists, older alumni whose eyes brimmed, journalists who pen words too slow to capture it all. As the lawyers conferred, motioning to documents and charts, one of the presiding judges tapped a gavel, called recess. Cameras snapped, phones recorded, reporters scribbled, but the moment belonged to Zariah. Outside, as she stepped into the foyer under the fluorescent courthouse lights, a roar rose beyond the doors. Hundreds, then thousands, gathered on the plaza, a crowd she had never asked for, a movement she had never intended to lead. They held signs with names of expelled students from the 1960s, banners referencing erased protests, images of the artifacts she had found. Their chants echoed in waves. "We remember, truth before prestige, your legacy is built on stolen dignity." At that moment, Zariah realized something that echoed deeper than victory or vindication. This wasn't just about her. It was about every voice that had ever been silenced under the guise of progress. The rest of the day blurred. Media interviews, congratulating protective embraces, the weight of reality settling in. She walked past brick buildings and marble arches that once symbolized opportunity. Those same buildings now looked like monuments to deceit. The banners reflecting crimson ivy no longer felt like tradition. They felt like nails. But even as they projected a united front on camera, the institution's defense whispered in hushed tones. Damage control, quiet statements, legal teams preparing for a long fight. Denial disguised as nuance. Apology disguised as ongoing review. They planned appeals, delay tactics, victim-blaming strategies. Zariah knew the fight was far from over, but something inside her had shifted. She had taken their history, the dirt, the bones, the suppressed records, and turned it into evidence. And now the world was watching. That evening, late, as she returned to her temporary housing arranged by activists and allies, her phone buzzed with a flurry of messages. From supporters, from old classmates, from journalists. She opened one from a friend she hadn't spoken to in years. He wrote simply, "I found 3 more names connected to your cohort. Their emails are gone. Their phones disconnected." Another message came from ZW02, the anonymous whistleblower who had first leaked the vault map and later the footage. His text was short, urgent, and chilling. "They are deleting the nodes. Clean delivery. Keep moving. Zariah shut her laptop. She thought about the protesters outside, shouting names, demanding justice. She thought about the vault, the ledger, the lost students, and the weight of history finally surfacing. She wasn't done yet. As night fell, her live stream feed on a major independent news network showed the numbers. Over 10,000 people streaming simultaneously from campuses across the country. And the final on-screen message blinked. Case D4787H. Jury deliberating. Verdict awaited. The camera panned out to show protesters massing on the courthouse steps, their chants building like thunder. The jury remained inside. Outside, justice and reckoning were colliding. When Zariah Walker walked onto the podium in Sanders Hall, a lecture room she had once entered as a nervous freshman with a scholarship and a trembling hope, the air inside felt charged, alive. The seats, once neat rows of anonymity, buzzed now with intent. Students, faculty, alumni, journalists, activists, all packed in quietly, leaning forward as if waiting for a verdict. The same walls that had once echoed whispers of doubt now waited to hear truth. She stood there not as a student, not as an interloper, but as a witness to history and a herald of accountability. The stage lights softened, casting a warm halo around her. Behind her, the projection screen glowed softly, ready for the final lecture she had promised. The Violence of Respectability and the Myth of Merit. The title alone sent a stir through the crowd, a direct challenge to the polished veneer of prestige and the polished lies of institutions. As she began, her voice carried the weight of every suppressed name she'd unearthed. Lillian, Mavis, the students erased from records, the journals of protest buried in vaults, the ledger files stamped with deletion orders. She didn't use anger as a weapon. She used clarity, evidence. History laid bare in documents, photographs, reel-to-reel footage reanimated on the screen behind her. Each slide peeled away layers of what the audience had been taught to accept as neutral. She traced the lineage of meritocracy, from land deeds with names like Trenton or Wexler, to slavery-era servitude lists, to coded psychological dossiers where behavioral risk meant potential dissent. She walked them through archived sit-in footage, flyers from 1971 shouting demands for recognition, letters from expelled students pleading for justice. She projected ledger entries where students were marked not for academic failure, but for social threat potential, unadjusted tone, instability. She walked them through pages where children of maids and groundskeepers had once walked these very halls, as ghosts, as invisible labor that built the campus, as unseen bones that formed its foundation. The hall was silent for a long time. No murmurs, no shifting seats, not even a cough. The weight of cumulative truth, of century-old oppressions, crystallized in scanned documents, pressed on everyone present. She watched faces, some filled with regret, others with shock, older alumni poised with polite discomfort, younger students blinking rapidly, absorbing what they had never been told. There were no cheering crowds. This wasn't spectacle. It was reckoning. Zariah's own heart pounded, not in fear, but with resolve. She realized that this moment was more than vindication. It was reclamation. Everything the institution had tried to bury, rewrite, sanitize, she was resurrecting it. In public, under fluorescent lights, for scholarship, for accountability, for memory. As she reached the final slide, the image that filled the screen was quiet, but powerful. A black and white photo of a young woman, with a folded sign reading, "Our tuition isn't acceptance." Behind her, tall columns of the campus buildings stood unchanged, oblivious. Under the photo in bold text, "Honor me with truth, not tokens." Zariah paused. The silence stretched. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, long enough to gather what she carried. Then she moved forward with the declaration nobody saw coming. She announced that she refused the honorary degree Harvard had prepared for her. Not because she didn't deserve it, but because she would never accept a token meant to gloss over systemic injustice. She said that the reward, the degree, the recognition would have been hollow as long as entire legacies remained hidden, entire bloodlines remained unacknowledged, entire vaults of erased protest remained sealed in oblivion. She would not take a symbolic crown when the foundations beneath had never been cleansed. Instead, she revealed she was founding a new institution, not just a university, but a living archive and network for students of color, descendants of servitude, laborers, and scholars from marginalized backgrounds. Its mission: to educate, to commemorate, to teach truth, to build a curriculum unbound by sanitized history, to preserve memory where memory had been denied, to elevate voices systematically suppressed, She called it the Walker Institute for Liberation and Memory. The name resonated, grounding in her family bloodline, rising from her grandmother's past, invoking a legacy of resistance rather than compliance. The crowd exhaled collectively. Shock rippled. Some faces blanched. Others stirred, hopeful. Cameras flickered. Phones recorded. The air vibrated not with polite applause but with a shifting current, the sense that a foundation was cracking, that something old was ending, and something new was beginning. For a moment, time felt suspended. The institution that had tried to define her, to erase her, had been redefined on its own stage, under the very roof that once rejected her presence. She had turned their lecture halls into confessionals, their archival silence into a public unveiling, their ivy-covered walls into a classroom of truth. As she walked off the stage, applause rose. Not the tentative kind student, get after a public defense, but deep, resonant, grounded, from students, from alumni whose ancestors had built these buildings, from elders whose bones had labored under servitude. This was not just for her, it was for them, for every erased name, every silent protest, every hidden ledger. Backstage, the same professors who had once mocked her intellect now looked away or shifted uncomfortably. The one who handed her the textbook with the sneer, gone. The mentors who branded her activism as instability, seated in shadows. They were uninvited to the speech, but their silhouettes hovered at the edge of the crowd, invisible, but present, their legacy now unmasked. As cameras broadcast the final slide, the Institute's name, its mission statement, its founding pledge, Zariah stepped into the light at the center of the room. She closed with one silent vow, that the Walker Institute would never hide the bones of history, would never sanitize suffering for comfort, would never package pain as success. The applause roared again, this time louder, sharper, more charged than before. Outside on the steps beneath Harvard's stone columns, a small group of protesters had gathered. Someone raised a sign painted in bold letters, "From erasure to education." Others held copies of the leaked documents, coalition flyers, contact sheets for the new institute. Students she had never met approached her quietly, nodding with gratitude. Parents called her daughter, sister, hope. Reporters whispered over shoulders. Is this the future of elite education? Can an alternate institution unmask a monolith? But as the noise swelled, Zariah felt something else. A ripple of fear, of uncertainty. She had struck a blow. She had planted a flag. But beyond that flag lay uncharted terrain. The Walker Institute was fragile, new, unprotected, and already under scrutiny by alumni boards, donor councils, institutional lawyers. The stakes had escalated beyond memory or exposure. Now they aimed for survival. Late that evening, in a dimly lit conference room on the outskirts of campus, rented for the fledgling institute's first meeting, Zariah sat alone, at a long table. On it lay dusty files, originals from old vaults she'd smuggled out, next to fresh legal paperwork for the new charter. She stared at her own name printed under founder and president, felt the weight of that title. Lighter than expectation, heavier than fear. She didn't flinch. She exhaled. Then she began to sign. As her pen moved across the paper, the overhead lights flickered, once. Then again, on the second flicker, the door behind her opened slowly. A figure stepped inside, leaning against the wall. Not a student, not a journalist, not a known ally. A stranger in a tailored suit, eyes lost in shadow. On the desk before him lay a single black folder, stamped classified restricted. He placed the folder on the table, without a word. The air chilled the room. Zariah felt it. The pen in her hand stopped mid-stroke. Her gaze lifted to meet his. The room held its breath. Outside the glass windows of the conference room, the first flakes of snow began to fall, soft, silent, but certain, like the coming of winter after a storm. The stranger's presence was calm, quiet, but in that calm there was danger. In that silence, threat. Zariah's instincts sharpened. She realized then that her new institution would not just need courage, zeal, or conviction. It would need shields, legal support, allies, secrets kept deep. Because the forces she was up against didn't just deal in denial, they dealt in erasure, in silence, in retribution. She lifted the folder slowly, fingers trembling just slightly. The papers inside were thick, not just documents, contracts, non-disclosure agreements, threat warnings, and at the very top, a single line in bold type, "Do not proceed. International interest noted." Her breath caught. The final lecture had ended. The foundation had been laid, but the real war, won for memory, for justice, for survival, was just beginning. As she closed the folder and reached for the phone to call Roman, the room lights went out entirely, plunging her into darkness, while outside, the snow continued falling quietly, like burial dust waiting for dawn. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt unheard, unseen, or underestimated, type yes in the comments. What would you have done in Zariah's place, knowing the system never planned for you to succeed? Subscribe for more stories that expose what others try to hide, because silence protects power, and we're here to break that silence, one truth at a time.